And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker this evening, Craig Rasmussen. He's an associate professor of pedology, which means soil science. Not many people know that. In the Department of Soil, Water, and Environmental Science at the University of Arizona. And he's part of the Critical Zone Observatory team that's working to better understand the critical zone. Soil has been described as the heart of the critical zone, and tonight we're going to learn more about that. Please welcome Dr. Craig Rasmussen.
Thanks, Shepard. Or I'll have to get used to this. Thanks for everybody braving the cold and coming out. I know, like Shepard, the longer you're here, the harder it is to come out and be in the cold. Right? So yeah, we're going to go through and kind of give an introduction with lots of pretty pictures of different soils from around the world and from around the Tucson Basin, and give an idea of the importance of soils in the critical zone and to society and humanity in general. And so we have several things that we need to sustain life on the surface of the planet. It can be boiled down to four key things: soil, air, water, and sunlight. And so this kind of encompasses the critical zone concept and spanning from the top of the canopy down to and including groundwater. And soil is really that matrix in the middle which supports plant life. Water flows through it. It holds the water that sustains those plants. It provides the nutrients for plant life as well. And it's really it's that cycling matrix, or that matrix where all of that cycling takes place. And so some of the things that soils provide is a tremendous amount of biodiversity. The statistic that's thrown around is a gram of soil has something on the order of 1 billion bacteria. Things like penicillin and other antibiotics are actually soil-borne chemicals produced by microorganisms discovered in soil systems. They're key, of course, for food production. I think it's something like 99% of all the food production on Earth is produced using soils. Very little is actually done under glass in a greenhouse with hydroponic systems. Soil is the key matrix that cycles both air and water through it, cleans that water, dealing with contaminants and other components in that water system, as well as being what we build our houses on and roads, and also used as building materials, and a number of other services that are provided by soil systems. So what I want to give you an idea of today is what is a soil and kind of why should we care. So kind of why we should care is it's one of those things we need to survive on the surface of the planet. This is, of course, a Far Side cartoon. And just put up here, it doesn't show up as well as I wanted to, but dirt is not soil, right? Soil gets a bad name. You get told when you're a kid, you're dirty, go wash your hands. You soiled your shirt, take care of that. But soil is not dirt, so we like to say that dirt is just soil out of place. So that's the stuff under your fingernails, whereas soil is that living, breathing stuff we're standing on that actually provides all these life-sustaining services. And so what is the soil really, and why should we care is kind of, again, what we'll try and pitch to you and sell the importance of soils and natural systems, and kind of give a background and kind of the story of soils as well as the stories that soils tell us. And that's a lot of what we do in my lab and research, is looking at soil profiles and being able to extract the story that soil holds. Okay, so I put up a bunch of words and long definitions. These are the technical definitions of what a soil is. The nice compressed one is that it's a natural body, so basically it's a natural component of the ecosystem. It's not a separate thing, it's an integral component of the ecosystems that we live in, and it results from biogeochemical processes on the surface of the earth and things that alter the parent material from what it forms. And so, again, biogeochemical processes, what are those? It's essentially those things that change a nice chunk of rock here, a nice chunk of granite in the Sierra Nevada, to this beautiful heterogeneous soil profile where you can see layers of carbon accumulation and organic matter, and layers of reddening where essentially the soil is rusting and forming iron oxides and accumulating clay, and layers where things have been leached and removed from that system. And so those biogeochemical processes then include all of those things like nutrient cycling, mineral weathering, and clay formation, which then can lead to the structural organization of that soil matrix into aggregates and structures that facilitate water storage and water movement through that system. And when we break it down, really it's a three-phase system where we have solid, air, and liquid. And so the most of the soil and the subsurface is derived of mineral material, which comes essentially from bedrock, which can be either formed in place or eroded and deposited as a sediment through water or wind action. There's also, it's not a solid matrix. There's lots of porosity, and so that porosity can be filled with either air or water. And that provides that water holding storage, or that water storage and water holding capacity in the subsurface, as well as organic matter. And so this kind of highlights the organic matter stored in the surface. This dark brown color is due to the accumulation of organic matter with a nice litter layer and accumulation of needles. This is in a forested system on the top. And when we talk about soils, we go out in the field and we do soil descriptions, and I know some folks have do quite a bit of that. And so essentially if you take a class, often we take the easy route and we'll look at a road cut or a stream, a cut bank, and you describe that soil profile, that vertical face, and you look at that vertical heterogeneity and the vertical organization of different soil layers and break that into layers that are dominated by specific processes, such as organic matter accumulation in the surface or clay accumulation in the subsurface. And then this profile then is part of a three-dimensional body and which sits on the landscape. So oftentimes we describe a soil profile, but we also put that in the context of what we call a soil landscape, which is an assemblage of different kinds of soils. And so I put up this kind of a typical Sonoran desert soil landscape. Bring up this other slide where we have this result of this basin and range spreading, which occurred on the order of 10 to 12 million years ago, where essentially the crust of the earth was being pulled apart, kind of pulling up, where you have uplift of mountains and then sinking of areas of the basins, and those mountains then erode and fill those basins with sediment. And so we're sitting down here in the Tucson Basin, which is thousands of feet of sediment, but that sediment also contains surfaces that vary in age, from modern, things that were deposited yesterday or a couple days ago during the rain, fresh sediment, to things that were deposited hundreds of thousands to millions of years ago. And that age difference in those surfaces leads to a tremendous variety of subsurface properties in the soil systems. We also have typified by these elevation gradients. We've talked about, I think some folks have talked about the idea of sky islands and the forested systems at the top being kind of these islands of forest amongst a sea of desert. And we have this gradient of climate going up there that also exerts control over the properties that we observe in the soil profiles. And so we have these kind of typical landscapes where we have the mountain front, an old alluvial fan surface here that might be on the order of several 100,000 years old, and it has a unique soil and vegetation assemblage. And then a young basin floor deposit, which might only be thousands to maybe tens of thousands of years old, which also has a unique soil and vegetation assemblage. So this kind of comprises the main components of what we see in the Sonoran desert systems. And that's just a small chunk. There is a tremendous amount of diversity in soils globally. And so these are organized. There's a soil taxonomic system, of course, and if you want to drive yourself nuts, we can start going through soil taxonomic names. Things like an abruptic Dury Zieralf. Oh my gosh, all of that crazy name, but there's a tremendous amount of information embedded within that taxonomic name. And this just provides, this is the 12 major orders that taxonomic system is described in, and examples of soils from each of those types of orders. Things with ice and permafrost in the subsurface up above the Arctic Circle. Things that are poorly drained soils that are mainly comprised of organic material, to soils from cold boreal forest systems, to things in the tropics which are highly weathered and big piles of clay and iron oxides, essentially, to things that we'll see in the desert where we have accumulation of soluble salts in the subsurface. So this tremendous variety and the tremendous heterogeneity in soil systems, which makes it both fun to study, but you can also extract a tremendous amount of information from what these soil profiles tell you. And so I put in a little bit of background, this kind of the story of soil, of how soils have been discussed in the literature for thousands of years. The ancient Greeks understood and soil properties and nutrient cycling. Aristotle discussed soil properties, particularly in relation to plant growth and how they integrated the four elements to produce the nutrients needed for growth. And really in the modern era, it started to develop in Europe, and in particularly in Russia in the mid to late 1800s, really started to formalize soil science as a formal science, and really developed it and flourished. And so I put up this picture because he's got a beard that I've achieved to, but I've never quite been able to get there. This is this Russian soil scientist, Vasily Dokachayev, and he was really the founder and kind of father of soil science, if you will, and in particular the field of pedology and understanding how soils form and how they are arrayed on the landscape. And he was actually, the reason that this field was developed is he was actually hired by the government to value land and across the Russian steppe. And the easiest way for him to value that land was to actually quantify the soil properties and put a value on that based on the soil properties that were observed. And so it's essentially the birth of this as a formal science came out of a very practical tax-driven, the tax man needing to put value on the land. In terms of the U.S., really kind of another one of these modern giants in the field was a man by the name of Hans Jenny, who's actually a Swiss scientist that spent his career at Berkeley. And he took, the story is he, on the train ride across the U.S., coming in from New York across, the entire U.S. to the West Coast, he really started to develop, and seeing the diversity of landscapes, develop a lot of the ideas that he formalized into a quantitative system to describe soil systems. And essentially the idea that properties and soils, or the soil's properties of a soil, can be described by indicating the initial state of the system. So what's the parent material, what's it forming from, how old that soil surface is, how long it's been sitting there, and the conditioning variables, like what's the climate, what's the vegetation, what's the landscape position. And so he wrote this down mathematically into, if you take a soil science class, you'll hear this CLORPed term over and over again of soils being a function of climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. And I put the dots in here because this is open to include other factors. And in fact, humans have now become a substantial soil forming factor in and of themselves, and we'll give some example of that later, how we essentially are a force of nature. Okay, so as a pedologist, we use this framework and spend a lot of time understanding, or trying to understand, how you go from this beautiful chunk of granite to this wide variety of soils that all formed from the same parent material. And so that's kind of a conditioning with this idea of it's a function of the forcing factors such as climate and organisms and vegetation, which then drive those biogeochemical processes in the subsurface, such as a profile that's dominated by the accumulation and cycling of organic carbon versus one that's hot and dry and very little is going on. There's very little alteration because there's a lack of water to drive those processes. And then over time, those processes lead to an evolution of that soil going through a series of stages and evolving from kind of an initial stage to maybe an incipient stage of formation to something where you have this well-developed soil profile. And so I want to give some examples, again, going back to this Sonoran desert landscape so we can kind of bring it back locally and put it into context. And the first example I want to provide is an example of essentially what we call a chrono sequence. They're looking at soils as a function of time. So it's looking at this age sequence of soils, and these are actually, will be pictures and example from looking at sediment deposited by the Cañada del Oro wash. So just driving up the Oracle Highway up towards Saddlebrook, you can go basically span millions of years from the modern to soils that are close to 2 million years old. And as you go back in time, there's a distinct change in soil properties. So here's the young alluvium right on the CDO wash. You can see all of the stratification from different layers of deposits and gravels and sands being deposited by that stream with very little alteration. You can't see it in this photo, but just a little bit of organic matter accumulation up in the surface. And as you go back in time to older surfaces, you start to get soils where they start to they redden. So they're getting redder. They're accumulating iron oxides. And what you can't see from the photo is they're also accumulating clay and carbonates. And as we go take these further back in time, and by the time we get to soils that are 1 million years old, they're very red. And this is what we colloquially call, it's easier to not very easy to say, is caliche. So this is this subsurface horizon of calcium carbonate accumulation with a very clay-rich horizon sitting on top. So over time, the soil has accumulated clay, it's become red and accumulated iron oxides, as well as accumulated calcium carbonate, which is relatively unique to arid systems. And if we, I just wanted to bring up, and there's a tremendous impact on the subsurface structure. This soil is going to have a very different function and use than this soil here. You're not going to be putting a basement or a septic tank on top of a cemented calcium carbonate layer, or growing a pecan tree for that matter. Where for those kind of uses, these young soil surfaces are best suited. And if we take some of those data, this is just some data showing the age on the x-axis and the maximum amount of clay in that profile as a function of time. And so we can see there's this exponential increase in the amount of clay in those soil profiles over time. And so we say that soils are clay factories. So essentially the accumulation of clay is a hallmark of soil formation, where as soils weather, they're going to produce these secondary phases, which are small in size and are clays. And those clays are where a lot of the water and nutrients are held. Okay. And I put up in this graph, I hesitated, but soils also record climate change. We'll wait for the chopper to go by. So what these axes show is, on this axis is the annual rainfall, and on this axis is the depth to that accumulation of that carbonate layer. Right? So there's a direct relationship between the depth at which this carbonate accumulates and the amount of rainfall that the system receives. These carbonates are water soluble, so with more water, they go to a deeper depth. And so you can plot these lines of where you would expect to find carbonates at what depth in the profile based on the amount of rainfall that the system receives. And if we plot this line here is what the modern precipitation is, and looking at the depth to carbonate, you'd expect to find Tucson sitting up here. But when you look at the actual soil data, the carbonates are much deeper than where you'd expect to find them, and actually plot right along the line of a cool, wet climate. And so what this indicates is that in the past, the climate here was much cooler and wetter than it is in the modern. And indeed, over the last several million years, we've gone through a series of glacial, interglacial cycles, where during the glacial cycles, we were a cool, wet, winter rainfall-dominated system with pinyon juniper down on the basin floor and giant three-toed sloths and other things wandering around the landscape, versus now where we're hot and dry and those ecosystems have retreated to higher elevations. And so we can extract that kind of information from soil profiles themselves. Now, as we go up elevation, I want to show some pictures that are examples of soils going up in elevation across the Catalina gradient. So this would go nice with the new Mount Lemmon app. If you're driving up the Mount Lemmon, you can picture these soils as you move up in elevation. From desert scrub systems, we're very shallow, so these are forming on bedrock. Very shallow little profiles that get a little bit deeper as you go up in elevation, and are also more organic matter rich as you get into systems that have more primary productivity and a little more weathering that is occurring within those systems. And you can see that all the way down at the microscopic scale. These are examples of mineral grains from the low desert scrub system and the high elevation conifer system. And you can see this grain in the desert scrub shows very little alteration. There's been very little chemical or physical weathering of that mineral grain, whereas at the high elevation, where it's cool and wet and there's abundant water, that these grains have been completely altered to those secondary phases or clays. Okay, so we can, again, extract this kind of information from the soil profiles. And we can also look at how soils vary as a function of landscape position. So here's an example. This is actually up in Marshall Gulch, at the end of the Catalina Highway, just outside of Summer Haven, where we have some active research going on, where we're looking at comparing these convergent areas, or areas of the landscape that gather water and sediment from other parts of the landscape, versus divergent areas, which shed water and sediment. Okay? And so which yield very different sets of soils. Where in the convergent portion of the landscape, the soils are relatively deep and dark and carbon rich, where in the divergent portion of the landscape, the soils are relatively shallow and don't hold as much organic matter. And you can also start to pick apart some more information from these profiles, where you can pull out different packets of depositional materials from this profile in the convergent area, which indicates different periods of large erosion pulses and large amounts of sediment moving down that hill slope, whereas the soils on the divergent portion of the landscape are forming in place and don't show that sediment accumulation, and actually probably serve as the sediment source for these depositional packets. And in the desert systems, or the forested systems in the southwest, a large feature driving that redistribution of organic matter and carbon is fire. And you can see that again recorded in the soil profile, where you can see layers and charcoal staining of burnt and charred material in the surface of the profile that gets moved and advected into the soil profile. And post-fire, you have this hydrophobic surface with little vegetation cover. You rain on that material gets picked up and transported to those convergent areas of the landscape. So both sediment and carbon then travel with that water. And it's this cycle of burning and sediment and organic matter redistribution that leads to these nice, deep, carbon-rich profiles in the convergent portions of the landscape. And you can also start to model these properties and really pick out in detail the variation in how soil properties vary with topography. These areas here are the drainages, those convergent water and sediment gathering portions of the landscape, where we see we have increased amounts of clay and carbon and greater chemical weathering, as indicated here by the sodium depletion value. And so in these areas that are gathering water, again, you're going to have greater rates of chemical weathering and also gathering those sediment and carbon from upslope positions. And so that again leads to a tremendous diversity of soils on the globe. So this is a map again of those 12 soil orders on the global surface, where you can see some distinct geographic constraints, where we have permafrost soils and those cold desert systems, the mid-latitudes, which are varied in their soil composition, and then in the tropics you have a distinct set of soils. So there's distinct soil geography that can be associated with different climate and soil forming regions, which again leads to this tremendous diversity that we see in the soil properties. And so there are some folks who have taken this further and actually looked and brought up the concept of endangered soils. Okay, so this recent work by folks actually out of Berkeley have gone through and looked at how soils are distributed throughout the US, and then coupled that with land use, both urban and agriculture, and how much of this land area of those soils has actually been occupied or changed by human activity. And what all of these show are areas where greater than 50% or more of that soil type has been either altered by human activity through urban growth or agricultural land use. And a good example of that is the San Joaquin soil series. So there's soil series is kind of the most detailed level of soil taxonomy. And the San Joaquin, each state actually has the soil. So Arizona has the Casa Grande as its state soil series. I'm sure you all knew that, right? The type location for that, of course, is just up the road in Casa Grande and has a very distinct set of properties. The San Joaquin series is the state soil series for California. It's common all the way throughout the Central Valley on these older surfaces, so they have accumulations of clay in the subsurface. And this line right here, it's actually this layer where it's partially cemented by silica, and so it's what's called a durapan. So it's almost like a layer of concrete in the subsurface. And so folks wanted to be able to farm that land. And so historically what they would do, they would actually go out and drill a hole, drop a stick of dynamite in, blow that up, and then come back and plant trees in those dynamited holes. And so this was the way that they were using this land. So humans as a soil forming force. Now we can come through with a big D9 with a ripper on the back and a shank and basically take this whole profile, flip it upside down, destroy millions of years of soil evolution so we can produce crops. So it's a lose-win. We gain land for growing crops, but we also lose millions of years of natural history. And it's been done to such an extent that there are actually very few areas. And outside of what now is UC Merced, they have a soil preserve where they're trying to preserve this soil series from further development. It's ironic that when UC Merced got its charter and they were donated land for their campus, it actually sits right on top of one of the most unique landscapes in the Central Valley of California. And there was a huge court battle over whether they could actually develop that land. And given that they were supposed to be the environmental campus, they actually have moved off of that soil preserve to some extent. and also being recognized as well as soils and moving into the 21st century with growing populations. I put in these. This is from a recent article in the journal Science just earlier this year, quantifying again the amount of land that's occupied by urban landscapes as well as croplands. So a huge portion of the globe where with the best potential growing conditions for food production have actually been converted to urban areas as well as croplands. So we have these focused, intense areas of agriculture. And without proper management of those landscapes, this is an example of an eroded landscape in Africa where this was through essentially removing the vegetation and tilling this land and using this for agriculture that kicked off this huge, incredible examples of loss of soil material and erosion. And this is from Africa, but this is exactly the kind of erosion that's also occurred in the southeast following the tobacco and cotton belt expansion during colonial times, where a huge amount of that soil resource has been lost and eroded away. And this has been coupled with, this is showing population growth in red, and the black line here is nitrogen use from nitrogen fertilizer. And so this is coupled where we've essentially sustained our population growth by subsidizing nutrients into the soil through fertilization. And what this graph shows is the cost per unit fertilizer over time. And so we're reaching a crunch where the fertilizers are becoming more and more expensive, but the population is tightly dependent upon that constant supply of fertilization into the system. And so managing these soil systems and nutrients and this plant growth is really one of the big factors that we're going to have to deal with in the very near future. And so I just wanted to end with highlighting again that soils as a foundation of both ecosystems as well as society. And so this is showing that all of the services that soils provide, from food and water to nutrients and energy, buffering climate change through storage of soil organic carbon, recycling nutrients as well as pollutants, as well as the global diversity that we see in soil systems. And so soil conservation and management then are going to be central to sustaining society and our way forward in dealing with growing populations and shrinking areas to produce food to support those populations. And I always like to put this up from Franklin Roosevelt, is that a nation that destroys itself, or a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. So we were intimately tied with our soils, and so it should be a priority in terms of our management and what we're thinking about saving for the future. So I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to put up a bunch of websites for a number of different organizations. There's the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is the biggest. They manage all of the soil data on private lands and soil survey. If you've ever looked online, you can pull up a tremendous amount of soil information from the NRCS website, as well as professional societies. Of course, the Department of Soil, Water, and Environmental Science on campus. And I wanted to highlight that 2015 has been designated by the UN as the International Year of Soils. So we're in the year of the soil right now. And so healthy soils for a healthy life, or soil sustain life. So that's trying to drive that home. So soils, tremendous amount of diversity, and a keystone and cornerstone of our society. So thanks. I'll take some questions.